Let's say you have a VM installed somewhere and it has Docker running. Let's check the version of Docker that you're running. To do that, you enter Docker and -- version. If you couldn't remember that command, you can always type in Docker and then -- help. And you'll see way down at the bottom, version is one of the commands. And now let's say you want to know how many containers you're running right now. We previously saw the ps command to show you processes. Docker also has a ps command, and this will show you a list of all of the running processes. But in the Docker world, a process is really a running container, and you get the ID as well as the image. And remember that the images look like this. We have the kernel of the host on the bottom. We have layer, 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 layer. These bottom layers are all read-only. The topmost layer is writable, that's copy on write, and you have the what appears to us as an operating system on these lower levels, which again are the images. Now, when you start a container, you have to give it a given command. When that command finishes processing, the container stops. If you give your container a long-running command, then that container will continue to run, and that is why we see Docker ps listing 2 of these, because it is running this long-running command, which is init. You can also see when it was created, the status, the ports, these would be TCP/IP ports, and you can give them names. You can also get statistics about these running containers with Docker stats. Now, let's say you do a Docker ps and you'd like more information about these images. But let's say that you forgot the command. Remember that you can issue a docker -- help to get a list of the available commands where you can search for images. And of course, you can always grep for that as well with the -i, which is case insensitive, and look for image, and you'll see all of the image-related help entries. So let's take an example. We'll type in Docker images, and we'll get a list of all the available images. Where do these images come from? Probably one of the most popular places is right here. You can type in the image you're looking for, and there they are. Now, in the case of FCI, you will be downloading images, and then you can load them in with the Docker load command. The main difference between Docker load and Docker import is that load could potentially load multiple images. So let's say you're looking at this list and you're wondering, how do I run a new container, one that's not listed here? You can go to the hub, type in an image or container that you're interested in, and enter that at the command line. That command is docker run, and you can do a -- help to see all of the options. We're going to type docker run and WebSphere Liberty. And then notice that if the image is not downloaded locally, the command docker run will go out and download it. Once that's done, it's going to run the default command for that container, and you can see that we are opening or starting up a WebSphere Liberty container here. Now notice here we have essentially started the container ran the command, and we have a default server ready to run, but this is not interactive. We can't do anything with it. So to get out of this, you can press Control-C, and that may work, or Control-Break, and in this case it did. Otherwise, you can press Control-P and then Control-Q to return to the command prompt of the host. On some older versions of Docker, even Command or Control-P and Control-Q didn't work. In that case, you just open up a new terminal. So at this point, we've exited out of that container. Now, if I do a Docker ps, notice that the container that we were just inside isn't listed. And that's because, as I said before, that command finished. When I hit Control-C, it was exited out. And so it is no longer listed as Docker ps as a running container. It has stopped running. But if you run that same command and give it an ampersand at the end, what will happen is Linux will run the container in the background and show you the output as it runs. And that means you just press enter a few times and you're back where you would expect to be. But more importantly, if you type in Docker ps, look what's happened. We now have our WebSphere Liberty container running. But there's a better way to run a Docker container in the background. However, in order to show you that, we first have to stop the running container. So to do that, enter docker stop and the container ID or the name. By doing that, it means that a Docker ps won't show you that container. But in fact, it does still exist even though it hasn't been running. And in fact, there's a lot of these that exist. So to clean up the list, you can always remove a container if you know its ID, that is its container ID. And here I'm doing a docker ps-a, which says show me all containers, whether they're running or they're stopped, whatever their status is, just show me them. And then we can delete one with a docker rm and the number or the name of that container. Now, why did we do that? It's because I can now do a docker run -- help and look for a -d, which will show us the detach command. So we don't need an ampersand here. We can do a detach with -d and watch what happens. The container starts up and we don't see its output. Now, if you need to see the output, you can. That command is docker logs, and you give it the container name. This output here. And then press Ctrl+C to get out of the logs. So now let's say you want to open up a bash shell to one of these running containers. That command is docker exec. And here we can give it -i for an interactive session and give it a terminal so we can interact with the terminal. Then we give it the name of the container and which command we want to run. I'm using /sh for a shell because not all of these Linux containers have bash, but if yours has bash, you can do /bash, and that will bring us into a interactive shell. Now, notice that containers are usually very stripped down. For example, they don't even have man. You're also not going to find things like IP or IF config, and that keeps the image size very small. Now, interestingly, let's say we ask the machine, what version of Linux are you running? And by machine, I'm really talking about the container. This says it's running Ubuntu. But if I exit out of the container and I issue the same command, I get a totally different version of Linux. Also, a word about ports. This container is running 9080 and 9443, but if I ask the machine with SS, and by machine now I'm talking about the host itself, show me everything running port 9080 or 9443, notice the results here. There are no results because these ports are only for internal use. But if we do a -p when we run Webs for Liberty, we just get the ID back for the container. But if we do a docker ps, look at this, we now have a colon involved. Now 0000 is an IPv4 convention. That means all interfaces attached to this machine. And more precisely, it's actually this definition. So in other words, 9080 is this container's internal port, but we have no way from outside the container to get to 9080 or 9443. So if you create another container using the -p option or a lowercase p and specify IP colon and your port that you want, then this on the left becomes the host's port that will be forwarded into the container's port. And you can confirm that with these two commands, because 9080 will give you no results, it's running inside the container, but 32773 will, and it will show you the double colon. Double colon is the IPv6 version of 0000 for IPv4. And that means that if I go to the external IP address of the host, so that means the VM that's running Docker, which is called Docker1 here, and then I open port, say, 32773, I should get a response, which has actually been forwarded through a proxy into the container. Now, this particular container, it won't allow you to do an HTTPS, but that's a peculiarity of this particular